There you go. Hello, bonjour, Deondre Smiles and Disney-Cause. My name is Dr. Deondre Smiles. I am Black Ojibwe and of settler ancestry from the Leech Lake Nation. I am a presidential postdoctoral scholar at The Ohio State University and will be taking up a position in just a few months at the University of Victoria up in BC, Canada as an assistant professor of geography.
You Tansheg, yeah. My name is Dr. Max Lebrun. I am Michif from AT, from Treaty 6 territory. I grew up in a place called Lac La Biche. My Michif family is from Red River originally. And I'm an associate professor in geography at Memorial University, which is in St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador, Canada, which are the homelands of the Beothuk, which means I am nowhere near my homelands, but I'm a visitor here. So you're about to witness the second of two in-person Collabrary discussions. The Collabrary collaboration, which was never meant to be spoken and only ever written, is a collaboration between Dr. Smiles and myself, where we are trying to read with generosity, non-extractive relations, humility, basically the opposite of the way we've been taught to do as academics, where you often read for something, for your work, for something you need for your work, for a citation, for a data nugget, but instead to read generously and richly. And yeah, so this is one of those efforts where we try and talk about it together. This is the second one. The first one was a text from the same book, this big book, which is disappearing behind my background, on critical and Indigenous methodologies. The first one was Feminisms from Unthought Location, and this one is about rethinking collaboration. Shall I start, or do you want to start, Deondre?
You go ahead and start since I started the last time.
Right, okay. So I feel like this text nailed me on 3 different counts. The first, so 3 different correctives. It served 3 different correctives for me. The first is that in the spirit of Collabrary, I'd actually never read the piece, but I have cited it. And I've cited it because Kim Tallbear, who's a brilliant Indigenous scholar, had this amazing block quote from this piece. And I used the block quote in my book, but I'd never read the whole thing. And Collabrary is supposed to be about actually meeting authors where they are instead of extracting from them. And so shame on me. And I read it. So that was my first corrective. And it turned out to be so much better than the block quote. And the block quote was pretty freaking awesome. Good. And, taught me that reading generously is good yet again. The second thing is, even like I read the title in the author order, and it says Jones with Jenkins. And you read the first paragraph and it turns out Jones is a white lady and Jenkins is the Indigenous person. And I was like, rah, 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 and I got my buns in a twist, because whenever I see the white person before the Indigenous co-author, I always assume a power dynamic happened, mostly because I have experienced it many times. I hear about it all the time. It's sort of like just another Tuesday in the world. And the with, right, that it was Jones with Jenkins, I was like, oh, extra distancing, extra bad, something's going on. But of course, that's the point of the piece, that in fact it is with Jenkins and it is Jones writing it, and it is Jones' voice and all this sort of stuff, and that it's not inherently good for maybe the Indigenous author to always come first, or those sorts of things that I was presuming was true. So more on that in a second. Then the other thing is, one of its main critiques is that, especially when you're co-writing with folks that move through in academia differently, or maybe not at all, like Indigenous folks who aren't academic, or Indigenous folks who are academic when you're white, is that this sort of like lefty egalitarian spirit of like mutuality, where you try and like equalize things by like writing together and collaborating together in a certain way that erases difference and erases the fact that actually not all folks write the same way, or write at all, or collaborate the same way, gets rid of power structures, other differences in perspective and history, as you try and like mush into a shared perspective, right? That's its main thesis. When it called that out, I was like, oh crap, because I'm about to write a paper with an Inuit co-author, Inuk, who doesn't write, and she will never write, and that's fine. That's not the part that she does in our research. But I was sort of tooting that horn, and it's taught me, thank God we haven't started yet, because it's taught me that like actually we have to start with the conversation being like, okay, let's talk about this unevenness of writing this paper with someone who doesn't write, even though they will definitely be one of the two co-authors because it's our thinking together. So yeah, so it whooped my ass right out of the gates, and I found that very productive. Deondre?
Sure. So I found this to be a really, really interesting piece to read, one that resonated with me really, really deeply. So I'll read from the notes which I took, which were quite extensive, which is a really, really good sign for reading if I start writing and like cannot stop writing notes about it. So here's kind of my way of talking about a summary and kind of teasing out what I felt were like the most important parts of the article. So I wrote down that the article is a discussion of the idea of hyphenation, of the idea of settler hyphen indigenous or indigene, is both an attempt to bridge the gap between what we refer to as the self, ourselves, and the other, another person or another culture or another entity that we are attempting to understand. Yet also the hyphen serves as an important marker for difference in the distinctness between indigenous and settler parties in collaboration. And so one of the really kind of interesting things, they spend time talking about, the hyphen and the theory behind it and kind of this idea that difference and understanding difference and recognizing difference has been something in what we would refer to as kind of like a multicultural liberal society as being something that's frowned upon because it's equated with segregation and equated with racial inequity. And basically there's this kind of general idea that and I'll step out of my notes for a second here. It kind of reminds me of, and then growing up in the 1990s, there was always this kind of color blindness, and we're all one race, the human race and things like that. And we understand that as kind of being problematic now because it doesn't talk about, baked in inequalities, structural inequalities, and things like that that still disadvantage Black, Brown, and other marginalized peoples. So the authors kind of take aim at that. The really interesting thing that I found is that the authors did this experiment where, Maori, they taught a class every year, kind of on these topics, or ran a series of classes, and they're doing this in the context of New Zealand. They did an experiment where, they split up the class in half. So one half of the class were Maori and other Pacifica students, and they learned about Maori and Pacific cultures and the histories and things like that within their own group. But also another group was settler and other non-Indigenous students learned about these same kind of cultures on their own. Um, the Maori, the Indigenous students really kind of viewed it as something that was really, really good. Actually, they were like, yes, we actually can take the time to learn about our cultures and things like this, and we're able to kind of come at it from a viewpoint and from a perspective that actually helps us out, and we don't have to take time to um, try to appeal to settler non-Indigenous sensibilities and needs while trying to learn about these kinds of things. And the white students, the settler students, they viewed it as segregation. They said, well, we're not getting the opportunity to share knowledge with one another. And the Maori said, well, when we talk about sharing knowledge, really, when we look at the history of Maori settler interactions in New Zealand, it's really, whenever there's sharing going on, it always benefits the settlers. There's no knowledge that the settlers can give to Maori that benefits us. And also, another thing about that was that the white students, they felt some discomfort in, in the times when the groups were brought back together in meetings where there were Maori and Tongan and other Indigenous, facilitators that were talking about things that the white students weren't able to pick up and understand right away. They kind of felt kind of unfamiliar. The quote that the authors used was, white students kind of felt that they were expected to know cultural things that they did not know, which was really, really quite interesting.
Just the
So they
condition for learning.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So they talk about the kind of the way that Indigenous knowledge is included in settler frameworks that actually does violence to Indigenous knowledges because it's always done from kind of the settler frame point. Like the settler viewpoint is always viewed as a self, and Indigenous is always coded as other. And they talked about hearing and seeing, and really kind of basically, long story short, they said, well, a true collaboratory relationship between the Indigenous person and the settler is going to be very uncomfortable. It's going to be constantly shifting, and the responsibilities on the settler are ones that are not going to make them feel nice and cozy and warm. It's going to be something where you're constantly being called to accountability. The Maori author on this piece actually they mentioned via the voice of the settler that they were constantly being called in by members of their community and saying, hey, is this person trustworthy, like, or why are you doing work with them? So they really kind of said, that tension that's there when you're really being truly accountable and constantly negotiating kind of the ways that certain voices are prioritized over others, and the ways that you have to make sure that you're including both in recognizing that they're distinct voices, that you're not trying to merge them together, but rather recognizing that there is a distinct difference there, and that's not a bad thing. They kind of grapple with that, and I think the author, the white author, I think she's still grappling with it at the end of the piece. She kind of mentioned something like, because my Maori co-author didn't write this because I'm writing this, like, it's my voice, and that's just kind of the compromise we have to make. And I found that a little unsatisfactory, but I also kind of was like, well, it's meant to be unsatisfactory, right? Because like there is no clean ending to this. This is a constantly shifting terrain that has to be negotiated constantly. So I have plenty more written down, but I'll save that for, for more questions.
That's great segue. Great segue. So yeah, at the end, the white author says we need to subscribe to a politics of disappointment and ambivalence, because when Deondre was talking and he said, the white author is still unsettled, but at the end, because she says, well, she's writing it, and so her voice. There's no voice of the other person, even if it's the other person's insights. Maybe in your head you were like, well, then they should both write. But the Maori author doesn't want to write.
Mhm.
She's not going to write, and forcing her into an equivalency or demanding that she becomes equivalent so that you can both be co-authors is, first of all, inclusion into empire, right? It's inclusion into a space that someone's already said no to, in a space they don't want to be in. But even if they were like co-writing, everyone's collaboratively written before, even if it wasn't like even if it's within your own group of some sort. You can't actually write together in a seamless way where the voices, I mean, it might get mushy with increasing edits, but it's not a perfectly beautiful, mutual, constantly shared enmesh gorgeousness, right? It's chunky, something you wanted and didn't get in, that's fine, didn't, all that sort of stuff. So it's how do you stick with that unevenness and show that unevenness, as opposed to trying to smooth it out as if everything's good, which is a form of violence against difference. So yeah, and I mean, I think Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang talk about this too, and decolonization is not a metaphor. They're like, well, what about your ethics of incommensurability, where there's two parts, if I'm remembering this correctly, and it's a tough concept, and I've been trying to deal with it for a long time, but I like work with it. So an ethics of incommensurability just recognizes that there's differences that you can't mush. And in this case, it says you don't want to mush them, actually, even through celebration, even through mutuality, even through these egalitarian things, because if they're different enough, they won't mush. So stop it. But they also don't, ethics of incommensurability don't naturalize those things as always already opposite. Right? So it's not quite binary. And the authors here, Jenkins makes that move too, but she makes it in a way that makes me super cranky, which is that like, oh, Indigenous people intermarry, or Maori people intermarried with white people, so they're not so separate anyway. And I want to be like, no, that's misunderstanding what Maori is, and going to the DNA debates, which Kim Talber and many others have taught us, like, that's not indigeneity. So sorry. But thinking of it from my own perspective as an Indigenous academic, like I'm like at least a third and probably, I was going to say 5/10, that's half. I'm a lot colonized, right? And a lot of, I've naturalized a lot of Western ways of thinking, extractive sort of behaviors, which is why we're doing this Collabrary. Like, I'm just trying to read not like an asshole again. Like, that's pretty basic. So in those senses, there's, I understand the going against a purity politic. But I still think there shouldn't be a conflation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous sort of stuff and things. And some of those, and there are some things, and then I'm thinking about like Linda Twilley Smith's work, and Audra Simpson. Some of those discussions aren't for public consumption. Like some of these, like, okay, where are the blurry bits of indigeneity? Like those aren't for public consumption. Those are for Indigenous folks to have by themselves in back rooms, the same way these folks split up their classrooms. Because there's certain conversations you need to have with yourselves, and other ones that can handle more difference. So yeah.
Yeah, that was something that really kind of spoke to me a little bit is even as an Indigenous academic, the ways that you kind of start to just through the training and when Western modes of academic inquiry start to kind of think along these lines, right? Where it's like, well, I think back to my dissertation research, and I went through at multiple communities that I worked with. They had robust in research oversight programs that I had to go through in order to be able to get a permit to be able to do research. And I remember in one conversation that I had in particular, which was really super formative, actually, I was talking with the community, and I was like, oh, I was thinking about, I'd like to do focus groups, and I'd really like to do kind of semi-structured interviews. And they were like, well, sure, would you be able to explain to us kind of why you want to do these? Like, what's your reasoning? And I was like, well, I really want to, I feel that these are really, really good ways to even out the power differential between myself as an academic and, the communities and the research. The research person stopped me. They're like, hey, I have to stop you there, right? You can't do that. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? They're like, you cannot even out the power dynamic between yourself as an academic, as an outsider in our community, and the community members. And at first I'm like, well, what the hell are they talking about? I'm Indigenous, right? Like I'm coming in there with the best intentions, and this is like in a much younger and much younger stage in my career. And I really kind of sat with it for a long time, and I'm like, you know what? They're absolutely right. There is no evening out. That is one of those differences that you cannot smush, right? That I am a somebody a coming from a academic or a Western structure that has historically been very extractive, and B, coming from a discipline, geography, which has historically been extremely extractive. And I'm not from the community, right? Like there's always going to be kind of that underlying power difference there that I can't push down. So in that case, I was thinking like, oh, I'm an Indigenous hyphen academic hyphen ally, and I'm like, well, no, that hyphen actually is in that case, that hyphen is a chasm, right? It's actually a gap because I can't bridge that easily, right? That is something, and it's something I may not ever be able to bridge. And that's something where we kind of talked about kind of that, this idea of kind of inherent disappointment and things like that, and kind of this collaboration kind of framework. That's a disappointment I've had to kind of sit with, where I'm like, well, I can't ever even it out enough with short of giving up my position completely. And so what do we, how do we reconcile wanting to do ethical work with this kind of difference, right? And that's been something that's really kind of been a big part of my thinking ever since I finished my dissertation and going forward into the broader part of my academic career.
But I also think, sort of going on that story and thinking about Linda Twilley Smith's work, that difference and that chasm isn't necessarily, and it's not inherently bad, right? Something you have to watch for, be accountable to, right? That's basically what research ethics are. But Smith talks about like what happens when Indigenous communities actually produce their own researchers and then choose not to work with them on research projects, right? And actually prefer an outsider, because there's some things that you have to. I was on a call this morning where there are these two parts of this large and research heavy Indigenous nation, not in my province, by the way, anyone listening. And there's so much dirty laundry on the floor that they need an outside researcher to come in to because I'm not going to be on a side, because no one knows my family, because no one knows what I was like when I was 8 years old, because I'm not going to vote in their election, because right. But they still want an Indigenous researcher, but I have to be an outsider, and so working the hyphen and sort of articulating when I'm outsider and when I know what they're talking about and, can resonate and have had similar experiences, like sort of working that is the whole reason that I'm there. So, it's not inherently bad. And I think that's part of what I really like about this piece, is that it reminds me actually of strong objectivity in feminism, which I really generally dislike. But they do make this one point that they say feminist objectivity standpoint says, strong objectivity says, everyone has a partial view. Doesn't matter who you are. You have a partial view because of where you're at. And so if you want to be more objective and get a bigger picture, you bring in a whole lot of different folks, and then you can see more around because you've got enough different perspectives, and now you're more objective. There are many, 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 many problems with that. And actually this piece cites Sandra Harding as having this weird inclusive equivalency. So like as if all those different views actually are on the same plane and just have a different like focal length or like position around the thing you're observing. And she's like, no, that's not what happens. And I agree. But what I do agree with is if you own up to and are accountable to all the shortcomings and partialities, you end up with a more ethical project, right? None of it will ever be inherently good, but like being accountable to all its little nuggets makes it better. And it reminds me of the reading we did last time on feminisms from unthought locations, where they said sort of an anti-colonial perspective needs to be, and a critique needs to be brought in to decolonial methods because they introduce new power dynamics. So you're not off the hook just because you're flying the decolonization or anti-colonial flag. So yeah, so I really appreciate that these two things aligned on that a bit.
Yeah, no, I really totally agree, and I think that's probably where I was clumsily trying to go. Is that, I don't inherently, it's not that, well, Deondre is always at risk of being a bad actor. No, I think that the relationships that I have with those communities actually have been strengthened, and actually are characterized by a lot of trust, because I recognize the difference, and I recognize that there are, part of the thing that I think when those white students in the article, they talk about, well, why are we being held separate? That's segregation. And they don't think about the ways that that Indigenous peoples in the Pacific and in any other settler colony were segregated and discriminated against for a super long time, right? And now, there's kind of this idea of like they're rushing towards, it's something that I always bring this up on Twitter when I'm kind of rabble rousing. Like, and I'm like, sometimes I feel like a lot of these moves towards inclusion, a lot of times are meant to kind of ease settler guilt, where it's less about, including Indigenous peoples and more about, thinking about, well, we're good people, right? And I think that's, I'm starting to kind of meander a bit, but, I think that, yeah, I think that, being really truly decolonial work is constantly being accountable and being aware and understanding those differences, and recognizing them, but still being able to do good work in spite of them, or even like in, being supported by that difference, which is something that I'm trying to think about deeply as I move to another part of the world, and work with other nations, which I have absolutely hopefully work with other nations. I never want to assume that I'm just going to be able to come in and work with communities, but hopefully working with communities that are much different than my own and have far different systems of kinship and accountability and things of that nature. So I'm probably not doing a great job at conveying it, but I'm like geeking out over this piece. This is probably one of the most generative pieces I've read in quite some time.
Yeah, so a little bit about this inclusion thing. So she says a couple things about inclusion. So the thing that she doesn't talk very much about, but sort of mentions in passing, is this inclusion into empire, right? Like teaching, like Girls to Code is like my primary example, or like summer school for Indigenous folks to learn science. We're like, you guys are, we know you've got the fuzzy end of the lollipop. We know this is an inequitable situation. And so we're going to bring you into structures to help you know the way that we know. And that will liberate you. But it basically brings people from one knowledge system into the dominant knowledge system, and it's called inclusion into empire. It's a turn of art. I even tried to see if I could find the origin of that term, but like it's all over Twitter, it's all over the internet, it's all over blogs, it's all like, so inclusion into empire, right? You're trying to diversify your empire with like more types of subjects who are always a little bit lesser than the dominant archetype. She mentions that in passing, but the other thing she talks about is that this inclusion will all, especially it comes over the power line. She talks about over the power line a lot, moving the pegs of the power line, so that there are more people in this little envelope. She says it will always be a resource relationship. That's my resource relationship is mine. They will. So Indigenous folks, folks of color, trans folks, disabled folks, we are, when you're outside of the power structure, I mean, Audre Lorde talks about this. This, the slave and the slave knows all about the master and all about the slaves. The master knows all about the master, not so much about slaves. culture, right? And so when you're got the fuzzy end of the lollipop, you know about both sides, right? And so this idea of sharing, like Indigenous folks, what the fuck are they going to learn? They already know. They are already fluent in settler culture to the extent that they want or need to be, right? And so the sharing across the power line is always going to be uneven, and there's actually nothing you can do about that, right? No amount of tweaking or trying, like you said, like, well, what if we focus group it? Now there's no power dynamic, and they're like, no. So figuring out different ways to own it, to make that line clear, and to be accountable to that line is the thing, right? We'll provide the title, author of the book that we're referring to. The main piece that we are talking about, I will drop into the chat, right? This is the piece that was advertised. If I was just referring to another text, you'll have to remind me what I was talking about, because it was like so many sentences ago, I don't remember. Still Monday after daylight savings. Yeah, so anyway, this piece, thanks Karen for, this piece on rethinking the collaboration is unexpectedly brilliant. So I do recommend that people go read it. We do have the link to it in the Eventbrite thing from a library. So you don't need to get, like, this book, I think it's like $200 and it's this thick, and like, you don't have to do that. If you have a lot of academic libraries have this as a PDF and you can get individual chapters, and we've posted one online. So that's another way to do it. A little more manageable. So yeah, also if folks are teachers, I was going to say pedagogists, teachers, it talks a lot about the, like, how we're going to be learning about Indigenous folks, right? This idea that the way to, like, decolonize a classroom is to learn more about Indigenous folks, or like include more Indigenous authors in the syllabus, which I've written about as not decolonization, but actually about being inclusive and inclusion into empire. But they talk about it too as yeah, about this resource relationship, and this idea that quote, the liberal injunction to listen to the other can turn out to be access for the dominant groups to the thoughts, cultures, and lives of others, end quote. And the people she cites for that are all writing in the early 90s, right? So this isn't a new problem. So now I have to go track down those papers for new, because I wasn't reading in the early 90s. So thank you, Sonia, for posting that so people can nab it out of the chat. And that's the link that we posted so that people can grab it regardless of their access to libraries. More thoughts, Deondre?
Yeah, I really, when you talked about, invoking outer lord, and talking about, the fact that, in this, let's say, the slave and master dynamic, the slave has to inherently be more knowledgeable, right? Because they have to be knowledgeable about themselves, but also be knowledgeable about the dominant power structure. I think that speaks a lot to the ways that I think Indigenous peoples are kind of, kind of viewed within academia. Sometimes, the fact that I feel like, I've had times where this is less common now than I think it was even just a few years ago. But I think that people kind of expect, well, as an Indigenous person, you just kind of know about your own kind of topical focus, and then like anything kind of broader, when we get into like high theory or critical theory or things like that, like it's kind of like, you're not, I feel like there's always like this kind of audible, like, or inaudible kind of gasp when, like, I'll switch from talking about an Indigenous methodology to start talking about Foucault or things like that. And it's always kind of like, and talking about Foucault in ways that are not Indigenous in scope, like people are like, oh, that's I guess that's kind of a subset of that, is that everything has to be indigenized. And it's like, well, no, in order to survive as a PhD student, I had to be, not only did I have to be knowledgeable about Indigenous geographies and things like that, because that's what the hell I'm doing my dissertation on, but I also needed to be able to function within other spaces that are inherently hostile to Indigenous viewpoints. So it's like, well, yeah, I read Marx and I read all of these things because in my seminar, nobody wanted to hear about Audra Simpson or Leanne Simpson or Nick Gestes or anybody like that. They wanted to read Foucault and Marx and Gramsci and things like that. But I mean, that applies, even outside of the academy as well. I remember, um, you know, getting into a minor political argument, which I usually don't do, but I said something and somebody's like, well, you're on, why do you feel that way? And I explained, they're like, well, you're unsophisticated. And I'm like, as an indigenous person, as a dual citizen, in this country, being a citizen of my tribal nation and an American citizen, I have to be knowledgeable about two systems of politics, right? Indigenous. So where I'm getting at is, and I think I there probably would say Max would probably agree. Indigenous peoples have to always be knowledgeable about settler frameworks as well. Like that is how you survive in the state. Even the most base levels of survival, right? Like, hey, you don't go into that town at nighttime because that's a border town on the reservation and the cops will harass you at best, or you will get not alive if you end up running across the wrong kind of person. And so how the authors really kind of engaged with that, I think, is they there was a really interesting kind of um, conversation in the beginning where they're talking about historic events in New Zealand history, and the Maori scholar is like, "Yeah, I've heard of this one story that you're familiar with, but that's not really how that went." And the white author's kind of like, "Well, wait, what?" Like, and this is something maybe I pick up because I'm super perceptive to these things, but it's like, well, the Maori person is familiar with white Pakeha New Zealander history, but also they're familiar with their own history. They have to be knowledgeable in both in order to be able to correct these misconceptions about history. And I thought that's something really cool, and I think that's something that every Indigenous person has to grapple with, even inside and outside of academic structures.
Actually, when that part where I was where they talk about the Maori sort of, someone would present a theory and the Maori would be like, oh, that's wrong. That doesn't happen, because she has all of this ancestral knowledge and she knows so much about her place and her people and her iwi and all this sort of stuff. And it made me think about these cluster hires and stuff that are going on and how they're attracting, and a lot of folks are hired that are not rooted in their histories or their people or these sorts of stuff, regardless of their genetic heritage, which may or may not be Indigenous. And how important it is that we know our own histories and stuff like that, because otherwise you can't do that sort of maneuvering, and you sort of get included easier. Um, you said something I wanted to talk about. Oh, I know the story when you talk about being an Indigenous grad student. So I have a very different story. So first of all, as white passing, I have tricks that you don't have, which is that I can pretend like I'm white, like all the time. And actually doing that is a huge staying alive, getting out of dodge, staying out of trouble, melting into the background sort of technique that really does keep folks like me alive. And I can name situations where if I wasn't pale, I probably would have been dead. And to maintain that privilege, I worked very hard when I went into graduate school to never be associated with Indigenous anything, because I didn't want to end up like tokened and never be able to, I have an art degree, so never make art that wasn't Indigenous art, and just only ever be in Indigenous art shows for the rest of my career, which is of course a fraction of art shows. And then later get pegged into sort of Indigenous studies, but I was doing science and technology studies. And so I wanted to make sure that I could be recognized as that. And so I worked very hard to keep those worlds separate in passing. In the last 5 years or so, I've just been like, whatever, I'm stable, I have a job, I have tenure, let it all hang out. Plus it became imperative for accountability and ethics, honestly, the type of work I was doing. And so off I went. And that's when I got voice. Before people understood me publicly as Indigenous, I had expertise, I had research, I had work, but no one ever talked about my voice or bringing my voice somewhere or showing my voice up. And this article talks about voice as the antidote to the gap, right? To the absence of Indigenous people. When Indigenous folks show up, they have voice, but the voice is basically just a way to talk about dominant frameworks finally being able to hear something. Finally being able to read the thing or pick up the thing or hear the thing that of course has been like circulating around the whole time. And I actually really hate the word voice. And I kind of know why. Like I have this creepy feeling about it, but this work really helped articulate the very colonial, very imperial, very resource relation, very like inclusion while keeping you not quite as an expert. The way that voice demotes expertise. When I got voice, I was demoted essentially, or like pegged the way I didn't quite want to be pegged. It's also PS when I became wise, which is hilarious because at the time I've been less than 40, right? I'm just 41 now. I'm not wise, but it's the indigenous context, white people call me wise. I'm not so smart, folks. So yeah, so these sort of celebratory, equitable respect, the way respect sometimes gets used as these differences and like fold them in with the best of intentions, but reinscribing these power relations at the same time, recognizing difference, but then subsuming it into similarity or egalitarianism or universal we's, right? These sorts of things.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think you can agree, isn't it absolutely amazing that as soon as you're an Indigenous academic and you get the PhD after your name and everything's like that, suddenly you become extremely visible, and all of a sudden everyone like is very, it's like everyone is super interested in like what you have to say and like the information, and they're like, one of the things that I've kind of struggled with is, I got the as soon as I became Dr. Smiles, people were like, well, since he has his PhD, he must be an expert at Indigenous geographies. And I'm like, please don't call me an expert, right? I am not an expert. If anything, the communities that I do work with, they're the ones that are the experts, right? Like they're the ones that I'm doing work with, and their voices that are coming to the fore. But yeah, it's really like there's a section in there where the authors talked about hearing and seeing, and like how they're very subjective and things like that. And in the context they talk about is like the white author is like, hey, my co-author is there are things that she knows and understands that I will never be able to really be able to fully identify or understand with, even if I spent a lifetime in a Maori community, there is still going to be that difference in that gap there that I cannot bridge just because of the difference there. And that's kind of some of the ambivalence that I've kind of felt as an academic, is I think, well, there's that difference between myself and settler academics, like there's that gap, but also sometimes there is that gap, there's these fractures within my own identity as Indigenous, right? Like there are parts of my identity as somebody who grew up off reservation that, like, there's certain experiences that I'll never be able to quantify or be able to understand. And some people will be like, well, isn't that such a, that's so tragic? And I'm like, well, no, that's just kind of how it is, right? I can't magically make myself suddenly revert into somebody who lived on the reservation when I didn't do that, or somebody who has certain knowledges when I don't have certain knowledges and things like that. Like that's just something that I just have to be comfortable with. I have to be comfortable with the discomfort and the unevenness of my own identity.
Yeah, the ethics and politics of disappointment and ambivalence, as they say. Yeah, and I think it's a good case that this isn't just a white Indigenous sort of thing. And she actually talks about, like, when you say Indigenous, you've made the same like horrible bridging move to like mush a lot of difference because there's so many different Indigenouses. Um, yeah, and so how do we maintain that when there are different Indigenous knowledges and cultures and stuff, even within the same region, even within the same nation, definitely different nations, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's really, really tricky. So one of the things that I'm going to do differently now after reading this, and I've mentioned this already, is when me and my research partner, and in many ways we're equal research partners in that we have singular control over different parts of the research project. So I do all the lab work and my research partner does all the land work, sometimes called field work. But a site is not your house. So it's her homework, we call it. And so it's equal that way, but they're two totally different domains. And we don't really, we kind of know, like I visited her and like done some work with her, and she's come to the lab and I've, shown her the lab stuff. So we have familiarity, but in no ways are they, yeah, we don't understand each other's worlds at all. So, but when it comes to writing, that's back in my world, right? And so the question for, I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna sit down with her and be like, okay, so I am not gonna accurately reflect your voice. That's going to be impossible. I'm going to try and like direct quote things like you into the piece when we have our chats and that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, this is going to be an academic paper, or even like the report to the Indigenous government. I'm the one who's going to write it, but all the pictures are going to be of her. doing land work. So, and how do we feel about this? And what are we going to do about this? And where do you want to fall in the author order? Of course, she's going to say, I shouldn't be anywhere on the author order because I don't write. There's another power dynamic that I can't, so, but just having a chat about that instead of trying to mitigate it, which would have been, I think, what I would have done, which I know is what I would have done before I read this piece. Just try and mitigate and close that gap as tightly as possible. And I'm going to be like, no, we're leaving it open and we're going to let our butts hang out on that, and really articulate where that gap is, and how we're accountable to it, in various ways.
Yeah, this is something for me to really think about as I'm starting to move towards actually creating research projects or research products out of the dissertation and starting to kind of talk about, how does, what do those products look like? Are they going to be academic journal articles or a book, or might they be another kind of project? And, I think that I can already thinking about that, I can already feel myself starting to want to do, well, we need to tighten this up and we need to tie this up and we need to really, there shouldn't be any loose ends. And I feel like I have to be comfortable and I have to learn how to make myself okay with there being loose ends and with, kind of, as you say, kind of letting it just kind of like sit out there and, acknowledging those kinds of gaps, because I think, um, any good conversation and good communication, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes if you're having, I'll bring in my dear wife into this. Sometimes we'll have a disagreement about something, or we'll have a tough conversation, and sometimes it does not get resolved that evening, and sometimes it just doesn't. Sometimes we just kind of have to say, okay, this is uncomfortable and this is kind of a little, it's kind of weird, but there's no closure to be had here. That's not a bad thing that there's no closure or no kind of neat tidy little bow to tie at the end of the conversation. It's just like we just got to understand that there are just some things that we cannot bridge, right? Like mushrooms on pizza, or um
Wait, are you pro or con mushrooms on
I am
pizza?
I am pro mushroom. I am
All
one.
right, we can share pizza.
There you go. Exactly. So sometimes even in these are all very, very low stakes kinds of things, right? I think anything that's a bit high, that's more high stakes, we definitely make sure that we kind of do get some closure. But there are just some things that we're just like, oh, there's just some differences, right? Like mushrooms on pizza, or the fact that I am a heat baby when I sleep, so I need to be cold and she needs to be warm when she sleeps. So in that case, our thermometer is at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and I just have to be okay with that. And but so just this is all just to say that I'm I'm getting I'm getting, see, this is what a good article does to me, is it makes me think about all these other applicable things, and that's how I kind of engage with this. But I'm have to come back to where we were, and talking about kind of these politics of inclusion and things like that. And hearing and seeing does not necessarily mean resolution, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that these things get smoothed out. It just means that you are actually, instead of othering somebody, you are actually engaging fully with them as a person, and understanding those differences, and understanding, if you can't find a solution right there, how do we go forward as collaborators in a way that's mutually beneficial to both of us. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So we have 15 minutes left. We don't have to use all those 15 minutes. It's a lie that you have to use all the time allotted to you in a meeting. By the way, there's no rule about that. But before we sign off, I was wondering if anyone wanted to put anything in the chat that they might want to surface up, for us to think about or talk about or find the citation to, or something like this. If not, that is also fine. I'll give you a couple of seconds. Oh, what's a good article to assign to undergrads in this area? So most undergrads are not in the position of collaborating, which is what this is about. This is for researchers. So it would depend on which part of this you want to do. Deondre, I don't know how much public scholarship and stuff you've done or which ones you lean on or use to teach, but a huge part of my practice so that I don't have to basically engage in this relationship and reteach white folks over and over and over and over again the same things. I do a ton of public scholarship. So I have this piece called There's No Such Thing as We that talks about this that I use in my undergraduate classes at the start. No one's allowed to say we in the course unless they say we, comma, the people in St. John's, we, comma, the people in this class, we, comma, the people I think that are like me, we, comma, everyone in the world. No, that can't work. To sort of help sort of understand that difference is important to note and you should not mush it. Yeah, that's one that comes off the top of my head that's accessible. Any other thoughts, Deondre?
That is a really, really good one. I have not been in a position to teach collaboration just because I teach undergrads. I teach mostly undergrads, and yeah, like my undergrads are definitely not in positions to collaborate quite yet because they're still learning. I'm trying to think. This might be something for like a upper division undergraduate course. But I do think reading some Eve Tuck might be a really, really good move, right? Like it's something that's, I could see linkages, even like decolonization is not a metaphor. I mean, I always like to teach that one because I think that people always think, there's kind of this move towards decolonization as being kind of the stand-in for, being synonymous with inclusion and synonymous with like collaboration and like, oh, well, I'm being decolonial, right? I'm incorporating indigenous voices. I'm trying to think of other good ones. I don't have it. Like I said, this isn't something I typically teach, so nothing's really jumping out at me. So I guess I would echo where Max is coming from, and actually I need to read that now so I can possibly start doing that.
There's a note like what would you assign to an introduction to Indigenous epistemology? And I flat out wouldn't, by the way. So I do teach. I have a course on the books on anti-colonial and Indigenous methodologies, and anti-colonial are for white folks and non-Indigenous folks, and Indigenous are for Indigenous folks. And I actually don't co-teach them because first of all, there's no such thing as an Indigenous epistemology. They're all tribally specific or nation specific or regionally specific or linguistically specific, however you want to talk about it. And I only know Métis ones, and there are no Métis here. I mentioned I'm far away from my homelands, and there are Mi'kmaq and Inuit and Innu, and I know shit about those epistemology systems. So I can't teach them, but I can teach people about anti-colonialism, right? About not assuming access to Indigenous epistemologies for their own enrichment, for their own data, for their own learning. And there's lots of stuff out there about anti-colonial research methodologies. There's handbooks and all the rest of it. Yeah. I also think that if I tried to teach that kind of course here, it would be horribly violent for me, and I would refuse to do that, sort of put myself in that position and get those student evaluations.
Yeah, I echo that. Yeah, I don't know that there is not any. I shouldn't say there isn't any text about that because I'm sure there is a text out there that tries to engage with it and probably does not do it very well at all. Because yeah, there are thousands of individual, tribally and nation specific, epistemologies that are out there, and even I teach a little bit of Anishinaabe epistemology related to the environment, and even there, sometimes I've kind of questioned whether I should keep doing that because I'm like, especially moving to a part of the world where there are Anishinaabe out there, but like I'm going to be a visitor in other indigenous territories, and I don't know their epistemologies enough to be able to teach that very well. And yeah, and I also agree. Such a course, the evals from that probably would be quite interesting for myself as well.
There is something Elder Albert Marshall, who's Mi'kmaq from Mi'kma'ki, which is over across the water, talks about two-eyed seeing as sort of a collaboration between Western knowledge systems and Mi'kmaq knowledge systems, and Indigenous ones maybe generally, but certainly Mi'kmaq ones, and how they can hang out together and work on the same project together. And because he's an elder, he teaches to like 5-year-olds and adults at the same time. And so a lot of his work and a lot of his talks are quite accessible and have lots of stories and good stuff in them. But they're not about Indigenous methodologies. They're sort of about good hanging out together of two different knowledge systems. Yeah. And yeah, he gives lots of talks. There's actually a white author that he works with who's published almost all of the papers on it, and she's first authors on them. And if you read them and then listen to Elder Marshall, they're like totally different things. But there's also quite a few of his presentations online where he's doing the talking. Yeah, there's a note about settler privilege and thinking about settler privilege, the history of settler privilege, the moves to settler privilege, that sort of stuff. Yeah, I mean, so I think that's part of what this piece talks about is like, instead of learning about Indigenous people or even from Indigenous people, you can learn about the hyphen, which is like the difference between folks. Yeah, and I've written a piece called Decolonizing Your Syllabus, ? You might have missed a step. It's a long title. It's a blog. I can do whatever I want in the title. It talks about, instead of sort of this move to inclusion as an inherent good, it's not bad, but it's not doing, I think, the work people think they are. Instead, teaching about how your disciplines have benefited from colonial land relations, because all of them have. All of them have. And actually, Deondre, there's some really good ones I found about geography, if we want to talk about that ever. So. All right. Yes, earth beings. Read earth beings instead of vibrant matter. It is the same theory, but one of them is stolen. I just saw a tweet about that. Yeah, I think actually maybe we'll give people 7 minutes to go pee before their next meeting, and a little bio break and a little body. So maybe we'll end early. Does that sound all right, Deondre?
That sounds good to me.
All right. Yes, let us not use up the full hour. Amen. We will post. So if you want more, don't worry. Deondre and I are on Twitter laying this stuff down like all the time. I do blog posts regularly about this all the time. Deondre does a little more teaching on Twitter than I do. I do mostly notifying. But yeah, we do a lot of public intellectualism in different ways. So if you use it, please cite it. And we will see you next time. Thank you, everyone.